All right. Welcome, everyone, to this Cradle conversation. I am excited and gratified to have you with us today. Today, my guest is Nicole, a good friend, a human rights attorney, a specialist in teaching about and training around diversity, equity, and inclusion, including a class around courageous conversations that I think has been really important for me personally. She is also the creator of a community called Inclusive Life, and at the end of this call, I'll be leaving links in the comments so you can find her. But anyway, I want to welcome you, Nicole. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for having me.
Before we begin, I just want to draw everyone close. I invite you to feel the word cradle in your body, the comfort, the container it provides, that steady, rhythmic pattern that can be very soothing. And in addition to just the visual of a cradle and the felt sense of it rocking, I also want to remind you of the meaning of the word cradle also can be the cradle of civilization, the beginning of something. And so these conversations are also intended as a creative exercise to cultivate a vision for something beyond these times that we're in. And so, Nicole, I think you know that every cradle conversation has 4 questions, but you know, I actually want to stop for a second and just say hi. And how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
I am okay. You know, I feel like today, as we talked about before we got on the call, it's the rockiest I've felt coming onto one of these calls. And so it just felt good to connect with you, and connection just helps a lot. So thank you for your friendship and company.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. So these cradle conversations are about, you know, what brings us that comfort? What is that thing that we lean on for that steadiness? And so my first question is, Nicole, what cradles you?
You know, for me, this is an interesting question because there's a part of me that rejects the whole notion of needing a cradle.
Bring it.
And it's not, as I go deeper, right, then I realize maybe it's because what I consider a cradle for me is a little bit more complicated, right, than I think of what is talked about when we think about comfort. Comfort's something, especially when I think about politics, is always something that really worries me. When people seek comfort, often I have found that they are then, while seeking this comfort, denying the truth of what's happening around them.
Yeah.
And, you know, because as you said in the beginning, I used to be an international human rights lawyer. Most conversations with me weren't very comforting, right? There was no, I was not someone who was bringing good news or news of success. I was often bringing, you know, bad news. And yet, for myself, I realized that there are actually multiple cradles, if you will, multiple thoughts, beliefs, dogma even, that I rely upon, that, you know, kind of pushes me forward, both in that work that I used to do, but also just living on this planet at this point, doing the work that I do, raising a family. You know, a lot of the things that I rely on is this real belief in transformation, that it is inevitable and it's necessary. Like it's part of our condition.
Mm.
And that also goes along with the realization, right? Not as comforting, but necessary, that a lot of this transformation is not going to come through comfort. It's going to come through moments of
discomfort.
Even trauma.
Yeah. Yeah.
Often those moments for us both personally, but also as a collective, like as a human population, don't come after, like we have these little discomforts, but they're not enough, right? And so then we get the big discomfort. Very much like this story of the exodus of the 12 tribes from Egypt. Right? So you get one plague, not gonna change your mind. You get 2 plagues, but then like they ratchet up, right? And I think that that story is a really it provides some real interesting commentary on how human beings deal with change. Even though change, as I said, like I'm comforted by the fact that change and transformation is inevitable and it's absolutely necessary. It's also something when we're confronted with it, we're like, whoa, we don't want this. So that's like I think that's one general concept that, especially when dealing with difficult things, or dealing with disappointments, dealing with setbacks, that's something that cradles me. Right now, I would say the thing that I kind of came into this moment with, almost, New Year's Day, the idea that I have had, right? And it's true for me, maybe it's not true for everyone, but I see this in the world right now, is that we were actually made for this moment. Like we were made for these times, right? So it might be uncomfortable. It might really suck. We might feel unheard and unseen. We might feel like we don't have any way out, right? We may look at our neighbors and think, how do I even live near you, right? Like, how are you a part of my community? I mean, we might be disgusted with each other and ourselves and our families, and yet I believe that we were made for this. And there are tools that we have in our toolbox, even those that we've tried to forget over time, that we can draw upon in this moment. Because I think, and I guess this also comes from the point of view that I don't think that things are going to be fixed, by May 1st, as the president of the United States likes to say. I don't believe that things are going to be fixed by June 1st. I think that this is a real issue and a situation that is multifaceted, and it is absolutely revealing and exposing so much of what we have because of our need for comfort, like we have not been willing to deal with. And so knowing that this is going to be more complicated than just a couple more months, or whatever people are telling themselves or believe, the fact that we're made for this helps me not only to feel comforted, but it helps me to ground. So instead of spending my time resisting what's happening, I'm able to ground in it.
So, it's interesting because the last time we were in conversation with Lindsay Para, we were talking about, like, the word avoidance has been in my consciousness since that last conversation. And so to me, when I use the word comfort, I really believe that avoidance causes inherent discomfort, And so even though like a cradle sounds all cushy and everything, and it does, I want this comfort to be coupled with courage, to be coupled with moving into change rather than trying to avoid it. And so I really appreciate just being able to talk about that, the inherent discomfort that these times require, demand, and that the ratcheting up. Like we gotta be willing to let a lot of shit go here, because it's not going to go, we're not going to get better by holding on to what has not served us all along, So, okay. So transformation. Oh, go ahead. Yeah. Of course you can.
So interesting. And it just came to me as you were talking, because I think you're right. I think that there is this notion that avoidance, can give that, and maybe it does for some, give like a momentary comfort, right? But in the end, right, it causes so much.
It doesn't go well.
Right. And it's like, it's not just like discomfort, like in a moment, like you're talking about generational discomfort, like at a certain point. But I'm thinking about a cradle and the purpose of a cradle, most people's minds first is to rock a baby, right? Mm-hmm. And what we know about human biology is for infants, being rocked actually spurs more brain development. Like, so literally the rhythm of rocking is spurring brain development. So a cradle is a place for transformation as well. It's a place to grow, right? And I think often where we get scared is that we don't get to choose the method of growth, right? With all of this unknowing. Like sometimes it is through that comfort, and it is a slower process, a gentler process. And sometimes it's a jolt, right? And so, the idea of having some really clear understandings of where you stand right now and how you are grounded, can help us weather those jolts.
Yeah. Okay, so transformation is inevitable, is one thing that cradles you. And okay, I feel like we've traveled far from
and we were made for these times.
And we were made for these times. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much. Okay, the second question is, do you have a cradle to offer us?
I think the second one is one that I would offer.
Yeah.
And I offer it because, so I was trained as a lawyer. So I have this quote unquote devil's advocate in me at all times. So what if that's not true? What if we weren't made for these times? How helpful is that opinion right now? I mean, really, honestly, with what we're facing, what we're all facing, like how helpful is that? It's one of those moments where we do need to parent ourselves through this, right? Parents tell their children they're the most wonderful, perfect, smart people on the planet. It does less harm than telling them the opposite. Right? Let's really think about it, right? Like, have we tried the intelligence of everyone on the planet? No, but what it does is it gives you a starting ground that is not of defeat.
Yeah.
Also, from a spiritual perspective, in terms of the spirituality that I live into and practice, there are moments that are happening, and I think this is happening for a lot of people right now, where the discomfort comes, and yet there's this understanding of familiarity. Meaning it's not, what's happening is not completely out of the bounds of what we could imagine. For some, even in the discomfort, I've had some clients and folks tell me that, like, actually, like, I feel like did I live in 1918? Because some of these things just feel familiar. And it's like the difference between facts and knowing.
Oh, that's interesting.
Folks have a knowing right now. And that's actually, this idea is something that Lindsay Parra and I talked about, I think a little bit after the call that we had, that we're moving into an age where knowing is going to, in many ways, supersede facts. Like when we think about facts and how facts are used, and this whole notion of like fake news, etc. I mean, no matter how you come out on it, the truth of the matter is that facts actually don't tell a full story. And yet there is this knowing that we have. Even doctors, there's not enough coronavirus tests in the country. We all know that. And doctors are talking about, I know what this is. I don't have to, I don't need a test to tell me. And even as people are getting tests, we do know that a third of those tests are false negatives.
Mm-hmm,
Right? The
mm-hmm.
test will tell you you don't have coronavirus, and you actually do. And doctors will say, I know what this is.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
knowing is superseding those facts. And so a part of saying that we're made, right? We're made for these times is accepting that knowing within ourselves individually.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, parents who, are getting too much work for their kids or not enough work for their kids from school or however like virtual learning is working, like there's a knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's not that you can just pinpoint, oh, I know that my child can spell 50 more words than it's being provided for me. It's also like, I know this person. I know who they are. I know what they need, right? And so, a part of the notion of being made for something is accepting those unspokens that you haven't had to draw on before.
Yeah.
And discerning.
Yeah.
Oh, is this for this moment? Like there are parts of me are for moments where like, there's brunch, right? We're going to brunch every weekend and hanging out and vacations. And like, there's parts of me that are made for those moments.
Mm-hmm.
Being fun loving, being quirky, being, all of those things. And then in my world, there are times for me that it is about, well, there's an uprising going on somewhere. And those tools and those knowings is what I'm going to bring to the table.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's not saying, oh goodness, I've never lived through anything like this. I've never had, this happen. We've never been locked in our houses. It's not just saying those things all might be the facts. Right. But what are your knowings in this? Like, what are the things that you feel that you're like, oh, I can do this.
Mm.
Today's time to break bread or to make bread. Today's time to just sit around. Today we're going to run around, right?
Yeah.
But I think what has happened in our society, like why this is hard, like why this notion of we're made for something or that we have these knowings is hard, is that our society does a lot to tell us we don't have that. We don't have that. That's not what's important. The real beauty of some of this, and I won't go into it, but I know Laura, have I've had a very intimate situation with the coronavirus, and one of the things that's been very interesting is how much folks in the middle of what is traumatic have also said there are so many things that I've never been able to do before, like rest, like calm down, like not be in a rat race. Yeah. That it's almost nice. Right? It's almost nice to be in the midst of this. A part of that is a knowing too. What are the things that we're missing from our daily lives before? Yeah. That this has forced us to accept actually matter.
Mm-hmm. That is something that I'm going to hold on to for a long time. That the facts don't tell the whole story. Like we can just shut down the conversation right now. That was beautiful. And it's interesting because in my work around bodies and physical well-being, that's exactly the direction of my work. Is we've externalized all of, like we've been cut off from our knowing, and instead it's like, okay, so what should my portion size be, or what should my macros be, or I need an app to tell me if I'm sleeping well. All of these like external measurements to tell you what your experience is and what you should do. And so this idea that these times demand that we really come back into a place of knowing and trust.
Yeah.
And
trust in ourselves. And there's a part of it, like, if I look at this again, like through a political lens, there's a part of it where you feel like really externally, what can you trust? Like, can you trust that you can't trust that there's enough tests? You can't trust that your state, for a lot of folks, for some of us it's different, but a lot of folks, you can't trust that your state is actually going to make a decision based upon your well-being and the well-being of your family or the bottom line of businesses. Right? We are actually being forced right now to shift how we trust. That it has to go through me first. And I have to feel it. It has to actually align with me. And that knowing is going to inform the facts I'm being given.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is very different than how our society has been structured. And it's, you know, it's the very core of racism and sexism and homophobia, transphobia. All these things tell us that we are imperfect, even if we're on the privileged side, that we're on the sides mostly of privilege in those, with those identities. Society has told us we can be fixed, or we need to be improved, or we're bettered by this structure, versus we come in whole.
Yeah.
And we should be informing the structure, and our reality should be informing the structures that we live in, versus the structures telling us who we are.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways, there, for some communities, this moment of reflection, if we're able to actually use it and grieve it and feel it and embrace it, instead of being a catastrophe. Well, no, it'll still be a catastrophe, right? But it'll be something where we're able to build something anew.
It's interesting, in my conversation with Mackenzie Mack, they were talking about how we keep saying, like, we've never been here before. You know, this has never happened. We've never seen anything like it. And they were talking about how, like, don't infantilize yourself by saying that you've never seen anything like it, because you've done all of this work to survive. You have skills, you know, many of them are applicable and valuable in this moment. And so I hear you saying the same thing. It's like,
I mean, because a lot of those skills aren't important or are outliers. I do think for some folks, this is another wake-up call. It actually very much reminds me of, you know, November 2016 wake-up call with the I mean, there are parts of this where it's like, we're getting messages, right? And the more you feel like, wow, I've never seen this before, I guess the other thing I would offer to folks that feel that way is I would dig in a little bit. Why is it that that's your experience? Because I can tell you, for a lot of the planet, a lot of this stuff isn't new. And for a lot of vulnerable communities in the United States and in Canada, I mean, there might be some interesting aspects of this, but the story remains the same. And so, you know, this idea that we can be, because of who we are, we can separate ourselves from other realities in our society, that also is being broken down. So what tools do you have to handle that? And I do believe that everyone does have tools. Your tools may be, like, my hammer might be bigger than yours, if you will. You still have a tool, right? And you work with it, and different from inanimate objects, it can be grown, it can be developed. Your insight and discernment can be matured.
Yeah. Thank you. Awesome. The third question is there something that we can practice?
You know, there's so many. There's practices that I love. I Jen Lemon's work around rhythms, rituals, and routines. So much about stepping out of, you know, the rat race of our society, stepping out of these notions of capitalism and our quote unquote, what is our worth, and actually being are huge. And I'm also for people just throwing everything up and saying, I need something new. Like, you know, I'm not necessarily digging into old rhythms, rituals, and routines, but creating new ones.
And that might be it right there. You know, like, what are those rituals and routines that are appropriate now? You know, rather than trying to band-aid your old ones. You know, that's kind of that's not kind of an interesting thought. It's a very interesting thought.
No, I think that can be helpful. And I would add that any level of a discernment practice right now, even if you have done a lot of work around discernment and fully embrace discernment, even if you're there or you're like, discernment, I'm about to Google the word. Everybody needs to, that's, I think, right now where all of our games could be improved. Because I think that at the time we're moving out of this age of facts into an age of knowing, what's pushing back at us is this notion of the supremacy of the facts that people that folks in power are willing to put forth, and really pushing on that. And so there will be folks, for example, where their states will open up and they'll say, the schools are back open and I have this knowing, right? If you are not within yourself practicing your notions of how you use your discernment, it's going to be a lot harder to make a tough call. Like, I'm not sending my kids to blah, blah, blah. We're not going to open up our business in the same way. So, especially if one is experiencing a lull right now where they don't feel challenged, really upping their discernment game, very important.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. The fourth question. Gosh, this conversation has traveled in places that I'm so happy it has. Really great. The fourth question is, do you have a vision or blessing for the collective?
Right now, it really is that the blessing is that they were willing to stretch. I want us to stretch. And I want us to stretch because I think, going back to the notion of cradle and transformation, I think that we as a collective body of beings really have the ability, like we have the values, we believe in certain things, if not for everybody, at least for ourselves, that if harnessed for the overall good would really change this planet. We see that our skies are more clear now, right? We see that we can live with a little bit less of certain things, but oh my gosh, do we need more of other things? Like, I haven't, my gas tank in my car hasn't been filled in over a month now, but gosh, do we need universal health care? We need a universal standard, a minimum standard of living. And if we need that, then everybody needs it, right? Not just people who live in, the Western world or in the United States. We all need it. But it's going to take us embracing the knowledge that transformation is afoot, and that's what we need to be on. That's the train we need to be on. But it's also going to stretch our notions of who we are and like what we deserve, because there's this inherent that other people deserve something else, right? And really think about what is the good of humanity right now? Like, what is the move for humanity? What's the best move for my great grandchildren, even if it feels uncomfortable for me? So my prayer is that we stretch.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It's been awesome, as always, to have you, to be with you. I love the Aries that you bring to every conversation.
Especially during Aries season. Ooh,
right.
I gotta rein a little bit in.
And so I want to, for anyone who's watching, everyone who's watching in the future, I again just want to pull you close to remind us that we really are in this together, and that is a source of discomfort that will lead to greater comfort if we move through this with that courage and the willingness to be transformed by these times. And so thank you for being here. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thank you, Laura, for doing this. I think that this is so right, so aligned, so what we need right now. These are the conversations we need to be having.
It feels good, if only for me. So, all right, so thanks, and we'll see you soon.